This episode of the podcast features a hugely insightful conversation with Mark Goossens, Managing Director, Head of Public Sector Sales for IBM Technology in the UK. Mark's early career, after moving into sales with AST, was with Silicon Graphics and with Sequent, and he has spent 25 years at IBM in various roles, including Client Director for some of their largest customers, and lots of various sales leadership positions. Reflecting on his sales leadership journey, Mark describes how his personal motivations have developed over time, and we discuss in depth the importance of understanding what motivates all of the different people in your team. Trust emerges as the key factor for Mark in managing sales teams of all sizes, and we talk about some of the ways that sales managers can build trust with the individuals and with the team. We also had a fascinating discussion about neurodiversity and some aspects to think about, as it is likely that at least one member of a sales team has some neurodiverse issues. Alongside his work at IBM, Mark is a member of the UK Central Government Committee at Tech UK, the body representing the industry to the public sector. Mark's passion for his role, for his company, and working with the public sector comes shining through all of our conversation. Enjoy. Mark, thanks ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. Really looking forward to this. Can we start? I start in the same way with all my guests, just asking you to tell us about the journey you've been on and how you got into sales leadership, and maybe also why, if that's possible.
Okay, so for me, it was kind of a bit of an accident and something I resisted. So I started off my career as an engineer. I followed my father and more importantly, my grandfather, who was kind of my hero, my paternal grandfather, into engineering. I was an electronic engineer to start off with. The reason I'm so proud about my paternal grandfather, he's Dutch, was Dutch. He's no longer with us. In 1942, he picked his family up and escaped from Holland while the Germans were arriving into Holland, moved to the UK. But he was part of the development of radar during the war, and that was why they wanted him in the UK. And he was subsequently knighted for what he'd done. And so I wanted to go into a career where I could do something as impactful as that, and went into engineering. And I ended up, after an apprenticeship and a bit of learning and all the rest of it, I ended up in an engineering role, designing integrated circuits. I was working on head-up displays for fighter aircraft. It felt like it was the thing. And started using CAD systems. I mean, this is 80s. And I was using CAD systems based on PCs. And I thought, this is an interesting thing. And started applying for jobs working for PC companies just because I was kind of interested in it. Okay. And I applied to IBM, didn't get in. Applied to Compaq, didn't get in. Applied to a company called AST, which were the third largest provider of, this is a long time ago, Stu.
Yes.
The third largest provider of clones at the time. And I got a job in tech support for them. And literally 3 months after I joined, the sales manager, who I ultimately became very good friends with, said, you need to come into sales. And it was really interesting for me because there I was, a qualified engineer. I moved into pre-sales, doubled my salary. I didn't need anything like the same level of skills. And 3 months later, moved into sales and doubled my salary again. And I'm going, I like this money thing. This money thing's good. And so I charged then at the sales thing. And I was with AST about 4 years. And my sales manager left and he went to a company called Silicon Graphics. And then he picked up the phone and he said, Goossens, come over here. The water's fabulous. And I said, okay, how fabulous? He said, it's going to double your salary again. And I went, okay. Right, so I followed him there, and he wasn't a sales manager. He'd gone back into a sales role, and that was my very first sales management learning thing, and it's something that stuck with me. He was very good, this guy, and he worked for a sales manager that wasn't very good. We're not going to name any names here. Okay. And this sales manager that he worked for felt very threatened by my mate. and as a consequence made his life almost intolerably untenable. And ultimately, my mate left, and interestingly, got into a startup that was doing this weird new thing called the internet. And he got in as sales and marketing director, got shares. 3 years later, they were bought out by AT&T, and he walked off with 22 million quid. And it was
very nice.
But, and don't get me wrong, he moved to Hong Kong, and he sort of disappeared from my life. But the learning there of the sales manager surrounding themselves by people that are better than them, and just celebrating that is a really important message. And sadly, that wasn't the approach that he took. But then, so I was there for 9 years in all at Silicon Graphics, and I started off in the film and media space, but very quickly found myself in a niche in public sector, and that was when my public sector career really started. I got really successful. I managed to figure out the formula for getting Higher Education Funding Council funding for what we were doing, and we managed to attract something like 70% of all their IT spend, and I was blowing away my numbers, and it was just crazy. Anyway, I think just as a result of being a very successful salesman, they said, right, you're going to be a sales manager now, and you're going to run public sector for us. And I'm like, okay. And that was my first foray into sales management. I knew nothing about sales management. I knew loads about selling. Although I didn't realize it at the time, and it's quite interesting, I didn't realize I was any good at any of this stuff till I was in my 40s. But I just thought I was lucky. I genuinely just thought in all of my sales stuff, I was just lucky. And it wasn't until somebody pointed out to me after I'd been selling for, 15 years. So you're just lucky every single year, right? Is that how it works for you? You know, and you kind of go, But I ended up in a sales management role, not really knowing what I was doing. And God, I wish I knew what I knew now. And I think I was very logic based. I'm like this, so I'm going to assume everybody else is like this. This is what motivates me, so I'm going to do these things to motivate everybody else. I hate being beaten up in this way, but it's appropriate to beat people up in this. So I just learned by watching the people around me. What seemed to work, what didn't seem to work, or more interestingly, what culturally the organisation did, and therefore I kind of copied that rather than having my own point of view about it.
That's fascinating. Can I come back on two or three things there? So can we just start with selling, because we're going to talk about sales management. But you're a really good sales guy, but didn't realize many people use this phrase unconsciously competent, and it sounds like you were very, very competent but unconscious of it. When you look back, what was it that made you such a good salesperson?
Sort of happened by accident. And actually I now, in my role as a sales leader, I actively encourage people to do. One of the things I did, and a little bit of this was my imposter syndrome, I would often arrive at a client meeting and go, look, you're going to have to treat me gently. I don't really know what I'm doing. And it was really interesting. I think I was about 7 years into my sales career, and I went on my first sales training course. And one of the things they said was, think about the psychology of what it is you're doing. One of the things that's really helpful is setting a level of expectation and then exceeding it. So actually by arriving in front of a client and going, I'm a bit useless, in a gentle way, what then happens is the client has pretty low expectations. So actually, if you're only moderate, not good, you can probably exceed those expectations and exceed client expectations. And therefore, you kind of start on the right foot straight away. I just did stuff like that instinctively.
Right.
Because it just felt right. And I think, knowing what I know now, a lot of that was probably based on the values that I now hold dear, rather than the values that I thought were important at the time.
Right.
Like trust, right? That, if you ask me my values today, it's my number one value is trust.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we may touch on that again when we start to think about sales managers. You said you resisted some of these moves Why was that? Is that
Well, it's
about
funny. I mean,
values or
I've been at IBM now for 25 years.
really?
I
Yeah.
arrived in IBM by accident. So I was working for a company called Sequent. Sequent
Oh
got
yeah.
bought
Yeah. Yeah.
by IBM, and then suddenly I was in the machine, and it was interesting to watch at the start. I think there were
Yeah.
43 salespeople in Sequent when we were bought, and in the UK, and within 3 months, 30 had left. But so yeah, and I stayed, and it was interesting. I think what happened was then I was doing okay. It was lovely to start with working at IBM. Sorry, that comes over wrong. It's always been lovely working at IBM. But I'd suddenly
Yeah.
arrived at a company where I had a business card that had a thing written on it in the corner, IBM in blue lines,
Right.
that meant you could have a meeting with anybody you wanted to,
Yeah.
literally. And
Yeah.
to then go in, and I'd moved from, I was selling hardware, but I'd moved from, we've got the fastest thing to we've got the most reliable thing. And you'd ended up having an utterly different business value conversation with clients. And that was fantastic. And I got to do, my first really big deal was when I was at AST. I managed to sell Reuters a dealing room system. And always when you're selling something, what is the value? Bizarrely, in that case, what I identified as the value was actually the footprint of the PC. It fitted under the 3 monitors they wanted on the desk, and a traditional PC just didn't. And it allowed me to win the deal. But that was my first big one. But arriving at IBM Big just takes on a completely different scale.
Sure.
I think it was literally only a couple of years after I'd been there, I sold the hardware for the electronic staff record for the NHS. And that was by an order of magnitude the largest Oracle implementation on the planet. Nobody had ever built an IT system at that scale, and I led that engagement. And then I think it was 2 years later, I sold the hardware for the NHS patient record for the south of England. And I think to this day is still the largest hardware deal IBM have ever done in the UK. And it was, it was a real privilege to be involved in those things. And so sorry, I'm answering your question in a really long-winded way. People kept wanting to promote me into sales roles, and I bloody hated first-line sales management. I didn't feel like I was involved enough with clients, which is the thing I really love. I felt like all of my life was CRM and spreadsheets, and actually, it's a really important aspect of sales management. It was something that I would say is definitely an attribute of a successful first-line sales manager, but I hated it at the time. You've got to be a shit filter. Shit is going to come at you from above, and your salespeople have to be protected from that. And your salespeople are going to generate all this shit, and you've got to somehow filter that out before it goes upwards. And I hated that whole aspect of it because it almost felt a bit dishonest somehow. So back to the trust,
But that is an issue that lots of people face today. I mean, hopefully it's less and less of the role, but you're there to provide air cover for the team. You're there to interpret stuff going up.
But you know what? It's also actually now I view it as a really important part of my role. It's making sure that a team are motivated, focused, believe they can achieve what they need to achieve, is all really important. Unnecessary pressure coming from above because it's coming from above isn't helpful. You end up with, a sales team who are probably sat there going, wow, am I about to be stabbed in the back? Well, all the time they're worrying about being stabbed in the back. They're not being productive facing clients.
This whole thing about IBM, I mean, clearly, if you have IBM on your business card or your email signature, it does give you a lot of credibility. But how much of it is just the credibility? How much is it? I mean, IBM, wonderful organization with, lots to offer. But how much is it just the confidence of working in that kind of an organization?
What I would say is today it's significantly different to how it used to be. 40 years ago, everybody knew who IBM were. When I talk to my youngsters, my youngsters are in their 30s, but I talk to my youngsters, if I hadn't worked for IBM for all this time, if I talk to any of their peer group, they go, oh yeah, my dad works for IBM. So who are that? Who are they?
Really? Yeah.
So I think, for older folks, it's a big thing. I think what I love today is we really are the very, very safe pair of hands for the really difficult, big, complex stuff. And so engaging on projects which are potentially life-changing or whatever is, particularly in public sector, is, it brings you something to get up for every single day. It's no longer the calling card that absolutely guarantees you access. The calling cards that now guarantee you access, so AWS or Google or Microsoft or Apple or whatever,
Can we come back to, I think we started answering this question already. So you moved into sales management. What for you are the key attributes or characteristics that people were looking for then, or certainly you look for now when you're appointing first-line managers?
I think the things that you have to do as a first-line manager, the single most important thing, and nearly everything else comes from that, is you've got to build trust with your team. Right. And you've got to build trust with your management. So it's like the opposite of the shit filter comment. Your team have to trust you. They can't be thinking, oh God, am I about to get stabbed in the back? They have to. You've got to use that then to motivate them. Understand the size of the mountain that you're asking them to climb, and then demonstrate that, well, actually climbing the mountain's easy. What you need to be. The reason it's easy is, and be really clear about that, right? Your target is, 10 million, right? If you were to just sell that one thing to that one client, given they're spending that much on that, there's your 10 million, right? We've also got in the kit bag this thing and this thing and this thing, and the value proposition around those and those, they're the things now that get you to 30 million. Get your whole team all thinking, oh, wow, okay, so there's a route to me doing 3 times my number here. And then what becomes really interesting, that whole pack thing, because that's another really important dynamic. The pack thing of the team is the 1 or 2 that are going, oh, my target's too big. They're looking at their colleagues going, my colleagues are all going to do 3 times their number. Right. So maybe I've let myself down if I haven't got to that point. And then I haven't got to say, why are you only doing 7?
And you seem to be very conscious of how you set those things up.
Yeah, and again, this is, one of the things when you said, would you like to do this? One of the things I've learned, and this has come over my life journey rather than necessarily my work journey, is emotional intelligence is an incredibly important tool in your kit bag as a sales leader. And I think not only did I suffer from imposter syndrome, but I looked at everything through my lens. I looked at everything through, this is my experience. This is what I'm like. This is what motivates me. Everybody's like me. And as my life developed, neurodiversity, I think, is a really important topic, and understanding that people are different. And it was interesting that the penny drop moment for me was, it was part of, because in IBM we do everything properly, right? The training in IBM is just fantastic. And I did a course of how to become a manager called Basic Blue that IBM run, which sets out 6 different management styles, encourages you to understand what your management style is, but also encourages you to try other management styles depending on situations. And I became very quickly aware that I was an authoritative leader. I think that often coercive leadership, which is another one of the styles, which is basically where you're almost bullying people into doing a thing, generally isn't helpful, required sometimes. But authoritative leadership is a little bit, it's leading from the front, right? So as a long-term successful seller, going, right, I'm jumping over the edge, who's coming with me, was I've always found that to serve me quite well.
Yes.
And then when you then think about how am I going to get people to come with me? Understanding them is really key. And the understand moment, it was quite interesting, was I did a 1.5 day course with IBM on the tail end of that called Myers-Briggs. It was really popular a while back. And there's a lot of stuff about, is it real, is it not real, or whatever. But the fundamental premise is everybody fits into one of 16 boxes, and they worry about the things that motivate you in 4 different dimensions. Yeah. And I just assumed everybody was in the same one of these 16 boxes as me. And don't get me wrong, a huge number of IBM people are techies that rely on intellect, and they're in the same box, or one of those 4 boxes or whatever.
Okay, yeah.
But I was on this course with somebody who was almost diametrically opposed to me, and I was asked to tell him as his sales manager that he was going to be setting up the new office for IBM on the South Pole and why this was a good thing.
Okay.
And he had to do the same thing for me.
Yeah.
And as a result of us both being on the course, but also understanding now where we sat in the thing, my sales pitch to him, and he is a very emotionally engaged person, was explaining to him by just drawing on a whiteboard a great big cloud how fabulous it was going to be for him and his family. His sales pitch to me was over 3 pages of PowerPoint with 9 bullets on each one. The thing you would never really do. What time I was catching my flight, how I was getting to the airport, and it was all this stuff that I just needed because I'm so data driven. And it was so understanding that different people have different motivations. That for me was a real penny drop moment. So as you start to become a sales leader, understanding how your team are individually motivated and being able to then say, what do I do for that individual? And what do I do for that individual in the team or the pack is one of the things that I think really makes a difference. It's because you've got to do leadership clearly, right? And leadership as opposed to management, really, really important, right? Leadership
we might come
is
back to that. Okay.
Leadership is, in my mind, leadership is how do I get somebody to do a thing because they want to do it?
Yeah.
Management is you work for me. I've told you to bloody do it. Do it.
Yeah.
And it's a very different dynamic. And in nearly all of our organizations today, we work in this very matrix structure. Relatively few people will end up reporting to you as a sales leader, but you need all of them to come on the journey with you. So leadership, really important.
Absolutely.
The motivation piece we've talked about a bit, but I think the other bit then is empathy, understanding where people are, what is it that they want, understanding individuals, what motivates people. And when I look at, I've sort of touched on this, right? When I was a young seller, and this was partly why I oscillated in and out of sales management, seller. I can earn so much more money as a seller than I can earn as a sales manager. And at a moment in time, what mattered to me, probably number one was how much could I earn. Second, what mattered to me was probably what did my peer group think of me? The people I work with, the other sellers in the team, did they think I was the best or did they think I was the second best? And for God's sake, if they thought I was the worst, that for me was almost as bad as not earning the money.
Yes.
So that was really important. And then just fundamentally being happy. So if I had to highlight my 3 core values, then that would have been them. And then as I've gone on life's journey, and I'm in my 60s now, it's the things that I care about have changed hugely. So now my absolute number one is trust. And we could probably talk about why that's a thing over a beer, but it's, let's say it's directly related to me getting divorced after being married for 20 years. But it was a long time ago and, things have moved on. But it was really interesting how that moved itself to the top of my psyche as being things that I should really care about. I think probably the second is I've now arrived at a world, and particularly in public sector, where I love the fact that we can make a difference. So instead of just how much can I sell that for and how much profit can we make and all those things. If we do this thing well for a client, how much will that change people's lives? Can we actually save lives if we get it right? Can we just make everyday work life better for people? Can we make things better for citizens? And I think the third one, and it's really interesting, it's why I now need to be a sales leader. I've gone from needing to prove myself and needing to earn all the money and recognizing that I'm okay at this, to going, okay, now how far can I spread myself with the skills that I've got by spending time initially mentoring and then coaching a larger team of sellers? How much more productive can I make all of them? How can I turn them into mini-me's that then the overall result is better? And those things now are way more important.
All that stuff seems to come together, Mark. When you talk about empathy, you talk about basing it on the individual, which, for me, is one of the reasons why really good salespeople can transition to be really good managers. Really good salespeople approach it from the point of view of the customer and why they're going to buy, rather than pushing stuff at them. And I think it's the same with sales management. It's about getting the most from the people in the team. And so your insistence then on understanding them. How do you actually go about that, though? Because you can't put everybody through Myers-Briggs. But
before we go there, because you've just said a thing and it's kind of resonated with me. I also do think it is really important, and this might be controversial, that the sales leader has been a salesman.
Right. Yeah.
I think putting I've experienced of, and don't get me wrong, the really good seller doesn't necessarily become the really good manager either. Promoting your best guy, probably a mistake. Sorry, guy or girl, but actually, I think it's particularly if you're going to build trust and empathy and bring the team on a journey and all the rest of it, they've got to know, okay, you've done that. You've been in that trench. You've been successful at it. I think that's a really important part. Sorry, I interrupted you. You asked me a question.
No, but you're right. We've had that debate. It is a bit controversial. I think most sales leaders, senior sales leaders, would say, yes, you have to have had that emotional experience. The Americans talk about having carried a bag, and knowing what it feels like at the end of the quarter when you're sweating on a deal. That's an emotional experience. And I know, in public sector, the police, you have to have spent some time on the beat. Officers in the army, you have to have gone through the experience that the troops have gone through. So, I think most of us agree that's important. But you don't have to have been the best. But you have to have that connection with them. What I was coming back to try to understand the people in your team. How do you actually go about that? What do you as the manager do? Because you can't put them all through a Myers-Briggs assessment.
No, and you know what? What you can't do is do it overnight. But the single most important thing is that you have absolutely got to not do what I've already told you I did several times earlier on in my career. Yeah. And that is just assume that they're the same as you. That's the single biggest mistake that you could make. So I think, it's sales 101, isn't it? Be really good at listening, be curious, ask open questions. And what will happen is, and it's all part of a journey, right? The trust thing goes back to that. Demonstrate some empathy, do some motivation, build trust. As you build trust, people will share more with you. As they share more with you, you understand more about them. You understand their motivations. But again, I said when I first started selling, instinctively, what I would do is I would go and say, I don't really know what I'm doing. Please treat me gently. The other thing that I would do is I would say, what is it that you want out of this? I understand we're trying to build this big IT system for you. I understand how this is going to change the world for this organization. I understand the cost model and all the rest of it. But what about you? What is it for you, the person who I'm now sat on the opposite side of the desk, whether it's the procurement person or the technical person or the CEO or whatever, personally, what looks good for you out of this? That's Sales School 101, right? What What you
Yes.
do as a sales
Yeah.
manager, I think, is the same thing. Understand from your individual salespeople what looks good for them. And so the younger me, what I wanted to earn a shit ton of cash. So that was important. So people who understood that, people then would maybe get to the next level with me, which is Mark's actually anxious in front of his peer group. He comes across as this confident, exuberant, outgoing person, but he's actually really anxious in front of his. I hated doing a presentation in front of my peer group. I hated it.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. Standing up in front of an audience of 1,000 people now is one of my very favourite things. But I love the sound of my own voice. But in those days, I just didn't like it. And so the smart sales manager was the person that had worked out that how I perceived myself in front of my peer group was important. And so the clever thing that sales manager would do is go, Mark, in front of the team, that was brilliant. That thing you did was brilliant. And it's really interesting. Once you start to understand those dynamics, I'm great. I'm motivated. Clearly, you've got to understand the rest of the team. Is that then going to shoot somebody else down? And so understanding if somebody else needs that love next time, that's important. But you can't do any of it overnight. All of it is a learning journey. But I think it's be curious, be open, be understanding of, what's going on and all that kind of stuff.
Right. That's fascinating. And a lot of it comes down to almost your character. It's not a set of skills. I mean, there are skills involved, but being curious, being trustworthy, these are things which, although we develop them, it's almost our character. You talked about emotional intelligence. Is what we've discussed, does that encompass all of it? Or is there anything else?
I mean, I think so. If you were to ask me, what are the characteristics? Because building trust is the core characteristic, my core value, then everything else, when you start talking about a topic like trust, you can't achieve trust through logic, right? No. You've got to, it has got to be about people's motivations, what works for an individual, all of those sorts of things. But then, as you start to go further into it, think about some of the things like neurodiversity, right? Neurodiversity becomes more and more common. I'm part of a team in IBM. I'm one of two exec sponsors for a team in IBM called PWDA, People with Diverse Abilities. And we have a resource group we have resource groups for all sorts of things in IBM, like gender, like race and so on. But we have one that started off as being about disabled people, and I'm in it because I fell 48 feet off a cliff, and as a consequence I'm disabled, and all the rest of it. But being in it with an obvious visible physical disability is a massive advantage. It's funny, I say that to people and they go, sorry, it's an advantage that you have a visible physical disability. Yes, it's an advantage because 1 in 5 people have challenges in their life, but for a huge number of those people, it's invisible. And it might be something as, they're deaf, for example. That's an example. But increasingly, I think being aware of neurodiversity and being aware of where people are on some sort of a spectrum, understanding that, but you've probably got people as a sales leader working for you that have some of those traits. And arguably some of the very, very best salespeople that have worked for me have had that. They can be really difficult to manage, but bloody hell, they can be good at selling stuff as well because they just think differently.
Yes. And that comes back to the comment of you probably don't want to promote your very best salespeople or those people that you come across who are just so different and such superstars. They are very unique and individual and probably, won't have that curiosity, that empathy maybe. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so if we were to try and summarize, what would be your three biggest hints or tips that you'd give to a new sales manager, somebody, thinking back to when you were thrown into the job with no training, a good mate who could show you the ropes, but his boss who was not a good manager. If anybody was in that position today, what would be the sort of 2 or 3 or 4 things you'd say to them?
So I think there's probably a good standard answer to this. And I think for me, it would be, first of all, understand the mountain. We've talked about that, okay, right? And then turn that into a positive message. Yeah. I think understanding the team at an individual level. And so spending time with people one-on-one, but also as a team, because getting the rest of the team to do a lot of your work is really helpful. And yes, that goes back to there are 2 different ends of the spectrum, right? Carrots and sticks. Bashing people with sticks is almost certainly not going to yield results. Showing people this is the prizes that you could have, particularly when you've got other people getting the prizes, as long as it's all fair and equitable, going, I want to be more like that person, is far better. For most people, quite frankly, not earning the money because they didn't hit their target is the punishment. Then putting them on a performance improvement plan, that's like the double whammy. Why are we doing that stuff? Right. Now if it's important, because we all have that 10% so that would be a thing. But I think, and then getting your sellers motivated. So they kind of my 3 things. But actually, it's interesting. The other thing I would say is that the things that probably wouldn't be part of the standard answer, I could probably give you a different 3 things, right? So building trust, I think, is probably the single biggest. I've said it several times.
Yes.
Being emotionally intelligent and thinking about the impact of your actions on your team and your management as a first line manager.
What do you mean by that?
Think about the way that you were. So the example I just gave you, right? What's the impact, right? So my boss says, right, you're all failing.
Okay.
If we all continue to fail in this way, we don't need all these people doing this job. We'll need less people, right? That, at no point does that motivate people. It just does. So it does.
Okay.
What it does is it motivates your best people to go, okay, there's a danger I might not be here, so I'll go somewhere else before somebody says you need to go somewhere else. Just thinking about the impact of your actions on what's it feel like if you're in their shoes. And I think the final thing I would say is find a proper mentor or a coach. Always there's stuff to learn. Now for me, there's stuff to learn. And so I think, those actually would be my 3 things. Build trust. Sales School 101, right? So, but it should be Sales Management 101 as well. Be emotionally intelligent and find somebody to help you.
Yes. I mean, you keep saying it's 101, but the practice is it's difficult. Yeah.
My instinct is your advice might be, if your organization aren't providing you with the training, why don't you go and figure out if you can get some yourself?
I guess, people listening to, viewing this, that's partly what they're doing. But it is difficult for many people in many organizations, which is why, we're doing this. I'm doing this and you're doing this, I think, because helping people to realize that actually trust is just so important, both for a salesperson, but definitely for I would say sales leaders at all levels. But but it's one of these elusive things. Yeah. Mark, I have one more question for you. We're going to take a very quick break. And when we get back, I'm going to ask you about your biggest mistake.
Bonus question.
Okay, Mark, so that's fantastic so far. But could you tell us about your biggest mistake and what you learned from it? Because I'm sure all of us can learn from these things.
So, I'm glad you're giving me a bit of thinking time for that one. And it's funny, you know, I've never made any mistakes. I've been pretty much perfect the whole time. A couple of things that I think come to mind for me, and you know, they both relate to the difficult part of our role as a sales leader. So the first is that I trusted an individual rather than trusting my instincts, and what I mean by that was I heard what they wanted me to hear, but kind of I knew I had that, you know, that's not really what's going on. And it was actually over an expenses thing. But this was an individual that hadn't claimed expenses and didn't appear to be doing what I thought. And when they kept reassuring me, and ultimately when I finally went, this can't be right, and got to inspect it, it turned out it was all very, very badly broken, and that individual ended up leaving through a disciplinary. And so I think I'm in danger of wanting to trust everybody, and I should have listened to my instincts. I think the other thing is that quite early on in my sales career, although I'd had some experience in leadership of making people redundant because the company was shrinking, and that's always a difficult conversation. Yeah. What I hadn't done was taken the responsibility that I should have done to manage an individual through a process that ultimately would have meant them leaving the organisation, because they were just in the wrong job. They were doing a job that they just didn't have. It wouldn't have mattered how much time, effort, and energy put into it to fix it. They didn't have what they needed to do it, and so it was bad for them because they constantly felt like they were being beaten up. It was bad for me because it became quite a big management overhead, and that whole, you know. But actually, the lesson I learned from that was it ended up being bad for the team. Everybody ended up suffering as a result of me not actually grasping the nettle and doing it when I knew it needed doing. It's really easy to not do it, but it's an important component of proper sales leadership. You owe it to the rest of the team that you as a team can't be carrying somebody. It's just doesn't work.
Yeah, and in my experience, the first time you do it is by far the most difficult. But there's a couple of things there, Mark. I mean, often what I find is our biggest strength is also maybe one of our weaknesses. You're a very trusting person, and sometimes that can come back and bite you. Is maybe a lesson there. But also you talk about trusting your instincts, trusting your intuition, which that really resonates with me. Although, you know, I teach management skills and stuff like that, there is a lot inside us, and having that confidence to trust your intuition. And when you think something's not right, it's probably not right. And then you, as you said, you need to dig in and find out actually what's going on here. That's really fascinating. Okay. Your biggest triumph?
Well, so I've already bragged a bit about some big deals that I've done without assigning values to them, and I should probably talk about big deals. But actually, do you know what? If I really reflect on it, there's two things. One is I genuinely now I feel privileged that people come to me in IBM, and actually sometimes outside of IBM, whether they're in my team or not, and ask me for advice, ask me for counsel, ask me to mentor them, ask me to coach them on a particular deal. I don't have time, but I enjoy really that give back aspect of it. I really enjoy, and I would say the fact that people want, you know, they don't come and seek me out because they think, oh, that'll look good for them. They genuinely want it. I love that. I do. That feels that I've done enough good stuff, built enough trust, and all the rest of it. The other one is it's really interesting. I've touched on neurodiversity, but this is quite important because this did feel like a real triumph. So I had somebody working for me. She was very good. She was leading on one of our larger clients, and everything I could see that she was doing was great. And then she would just disappear. and she would disappear for maybe a couple of days at a time. And I always, I don't inspect people all the time, but it's quite nice to know what your team are up to. And she then, don't get me wrong, she was always engaged in team stuff and blah, blah, but she would just disappear. I couldn't ever quite work out what was going on, and I sort of tried to talk to her about it and never quite got there. Anyway, one day she called me up and she said, "Boss, we need to have a proper conversation. I've got something really exciting to tell you." And I had no idea where this thing was going to go. And so we had our call, and she said, "I'm really excited to tell you that I've got a diagnosis." She was, I don't know, mid-30s, I think. And it turns out I have ADHD. And it explains to me ever such a lot about the way that I am. And she explained to me what an introvert was as opposed to an extrovert. I had no idea what the real definition is of an introvert and an extrovert. I'm a real extrovert because I stand on a stage in front of 1,000 people and I get real energy from it. She's the exact opposite. If she stood on a stage in front of 1,000 people, she would deliver a brilliant job of that. And then she'd need to go and sit in a darkened room to recover her energy because she'd have given it all to the audience. Yeah. And it was really interesting. And the triumph in that was that she and I had got to a situation where she felt she could trust me to share with me something that was materially massively important to her. And then I was able to help her to find another role in IBM that was much more suited to what she needed. And we're fortunate, right? I work for a great big company where we have these opportunities. She's now a data scientist in IBM, working in an environment where all of the other aspects that come with that. I mean, she told me once that she could visualize 13 different user interfaces simultaneously. And I didn't even understand what she meant, but that's the way her brain works. And so the triumph, the ability to help, to get to a point where somebody can explain that stuff to you and then to help them to move somewhere else, really satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have all these groups and abilities inside of IBM, but the key there was your relationship, wasn't it? And the trust that she had in you and you had in her to actually bring the issue to the fore and where she could talk about it, and then you can deal with it in a better way. Oh, well, that's amazing. That's really amazing. Any kind of final words of wisdom and anything you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, so it's funny, isn't it? As salespeople, it's almost expected that you have this sort of arrogant swagger. I think it's probably one of the least attractive traits. And I think sometimes as a seller, as a sales manager, sales leader, making yourself slightly vulnerable, being humble can actually pay real dividends. I wouldn't say it's the right thing to use all the time. None of these things are the right thing to use all the time, right? But
it's knowing the right thing to do at the right time, in the right circumstance, in the right way. That comment about a lot of people see arrogance in salespeople. I mean, there is this, in my view, thin dividing line between arrogance and supreme self-confidence. And that's one that really good salespeople, they bump up against that line sometime. Well, that's another really excellent insight. Well, thanks ever so much. And yes, we'll keep in touch.
Good. Great to see you, Steve. Thank you.
If you're an aspiring, new, developing, or an experienced sales manager in complex business to business, or you know of someone who is, you may want to go to www.realsalesmanager, that's realsalesmanager, all one word, .com, to learn about our unique blend of training and coaching to help aspiring sales managers to decide if it's right for them and how to go about getting a job, to help new sales managers get as effective as possible, as quickly as possible, and to help developing and experienced sales managers with a personalised programme to improve some of their specific skills.